It is interesting to analyze a scene which has been regarded with suspicion as to whether it is an interpolation. It is necessary, therefore, in the beginning, to cast aside what some critics have to say about such a scene being un-Shakespearean and vulgar, and judge it on its own merit. Any interpretation of a scene must begin with an understanding of its context in the play. The Porter scene comes after the murder of Duncan by Macbeth. Just after we get a brief glimpse of Macbeth's guilt-tormented soul. He drowns under the burden of guilt and is shaken to the core of his soul. He cannot bring himself to the fact that he has committed the most heinous crime, that of murdering Duncan, who is both his king and his guest. Just when he is so caught up in a mental turmoil, there is heard a knocking. It startles Macbeth to a sudden wakefulness. He has been feeling dizzy with the heavy burden of the murder and lying in a half-awake, half-asleep state. Now, with the knocking, he is shaken to full consciousness, as it were, and he is forced to see what great crime he has done. He has upturned the natural order of things, and therefore the knockings can also be interpreted as being the protest of nature against such a deed. Quote, "Now o'er the one half world nature seems dead," unquote, but the other half is still alive and banging against the door. The elemental fury in nature is suppressed but not obliterated. It is as if the whole cosmic universe is shuddering to see the evil Macbeth has invoked upon not only his soul but the world. The knocking continues and segues its way into the next scene, the so-called Porter scene. It is the same knocking that Lady Macbeth will hear in the sleepwalking scene, then reduced to insanity. The focus now momentarily shifts from Macbeth to a drunken porter, though we are still aware of Macbeth's last words in the previous scene, quote, "Wake Duncan with thy knocking, I would thou couldst," unquote. Act 2, Scene 3 opens with a heavily drunk porter roused from sleep and imagining himself posted at the gate of hell. With the knockings, the porter is motivated into a soliloquy in ambiguous language that typifies his mental state. He visualizes a farmer who has committed suicide, quote, "on the expectation of plenty," unquote. A farmer who hoarded corn to make money out of scarcity in the land, but hanged himself on finding the harvest so abundant that the prices fell. There is a topical allusion in the lines. In the summer of 1606, the prices of corn fell very low due to an abundant harvest. As the porter welcomes the farmer to hell, he hears another knock, and this time he believes the newcomer is an equivocator, a Jesuit who talks on both sides and, quote, "swears in both the scales against either scales," unquote, who commits treason enough in the name of God and religion and thus could not avoid coming to hell. Here we find another topical allusion. The reference is to Father Garnet, a Jesuit priest connected with the gunpowder plot of 1605. When he was charged with complicity in the plot, he tried to defend himself by means of the doctrine of equivocation. The volubility of the porter offers a sharp contrast to the speeches of Macbeth, which are intensely poetic. As the knocking continues, the porter is driven to his drunken surmise that this time it must be an English tailor who stole French hose, and he greets imaginatively the third comer with the prospect of enough scope for heat in hell to roast his goose. The continuous knocking disquiets the porter and almost makes him shiver in cold. Candidly, he confesses, quote, "But this place is too cold for hell," unquote, and decides, quote, "I will devil porter it no further," unquote. As the knocking still goes on, the porter now unlocks the gate and lets Macduff and Lennox enter and acknowledges to them in good humor the effect of late-night carousal on him. In his own typical way and idiom, he describes to them the relation between drinking and the things it provokes. With these, the porter's role comes to an end. The porter scene has long been used as an example of comic relief in Shakespeare. Indeed, the porter with his drunken sardonicism and odd gestures might provide some relief from the heavy ambience of the previous scene. But Shakespeare, we might suppose, could have used lyrical relief instead, if relief was needed. As Coleridge pointed out, Shakespeare never introduced the comic except when it may react on the tragedy by harmonious contrast. If the deeper implications behind the Porter's invention of characters, the farmer, the Jesuit, and the tailor, are understood, it is seen that all the three characters can be identified with Macbeth himself, and more importantly, the inherent and inextricable themes in the play. The unnaturalness of the avaricious farmer is contrasted with the images of natural growth and harvest which are scattered throughout the play. The tailor has his place in the scheme of the play because of the clothing imagery which is so abundant in it. Equivocation links up with one of the main themes of the play, and the reference to Father Garnet, the Jesuit priest, seems obvious considering that Macbeth himself at times speaks in a language that is equivocating without even knowing it. Indeed, Macbeth, on his first appearance after the discovery of the murder, is compelled to equivocate, and later in the same scene there is an even more striking equivocation. Quote, "Had I but died an hour before this chance, I had lived a blessed time, for from this instant there is nothing serious in mortality." Unquote. The audience knows, as Macbeth was to know, that the words are a precise description of the truth about himself. By an ironical twist, Macbeth's own equivocation of the fiend becomes an aspect of truth. Considering all these underlying aspects of the Porter's speech, it becomes impossible to fully agree with those critics who suppose that the function of the Porter is to take the present horror away from the scene. On the contrary, the effect of the Porter scene is almost the exact opposite. It is there to increase our feelings of horror. We are never allowed to forget throughout the scene that a murder has been committed and that it is about to be discovered. Thus, the Porter's speech is comic relief only if we take it to be so. Shakespeare was aware of the different levels in his audience and their tastes. He knew that the Porter could be a device to induce laughter and amusement in the groundlings, but a more perceptive audience, or reader for that matter, apprehend the fine symbolism and prolepsis behind what apparently sounds like tipsy nonsense. It is also a theatrical necessity that the actor who enacts the role of Macbeth should get some time to change his costumes and wash his hands. This scene serves to give a rational place for the discharge of the actions. Shakespeare, being fully aware and conversant with theatrical necessities, deliberately placed the scene as part of the stagecraft, but its significance does not end there. In his opening words, the Porter identifies himself with the Porter of Hellgate, who was expected to make jests, but who was something more than a jester. He appears in the plays which are based on the theme of harrowing of hell in York, Chester, and Townley cycles. John B. Harcourt in I Pray You Remember the Porter, 1961, and Glyn Wickham in Hell Castle and His Doorkeeper in 1966 stretch the comparison further in suggesting that the knocking on the gate and the entrance of Macduff recall the entrance of Christ in hell. The identification is not entirely pointless, for it is Macduff who finally defeats Macbeth and purges Scotland of evil. First, it transports us from Inverness to Gate of Hell without violating the unity of place. Macbeth's castle is hell because Lady Macbeth has invoked the murdering ministers, because Macbeth has called on the stars to hide their fires, and because hell is a state, not a place. However, some critics have taken the comparison to great lengths in saying that Macbeth's tragedy might appear as second fall, with Lady Macbeth as a second Eve. Such comparisons are baseless, since Macbeth is no Adam, and unlike Adam, Macbeth is incapable of redemption. He is, at best, a tragic hero. Shakespeare's second reason for recalling the miracle plays was that it enabled him to transcend the boundaries of space and time, so that on one hand it could be universalized, and on the other it could be made more contemporary. The Porter's speech takes us in various directions. The reference to the Jesuit equivocator who committed treason enough looks back to the executed Thane of Cawdor, the gentleman on whom Duncan built an absolute trust, and it looks forward to the dialogue between Lady Macduff and her son, and to the long testing of Macduff by Malcolm, which shows the distrust and suspicion which grow from equivocation. Later in the play, Macbeth complains of the, quote, the equivocation of the fiend that lies like truth, unquote, and of those juggling fiends, quote, that palter with us in a double sense, unquote. The equivocation becomes one of the recurrent motifs in the play's course, which heightens the tragic irony. Equally significant is the paradox the porter employs in his speech while talking to Macduff. Provokes, unprovokes, desire, performance, makes, mars, sets on, takes off, persuades, disheartens, stands to, not stand to. The contrast between desire and performance is repeated several times in the play. Lady Macbeth's facile realism, quote, "A little water clears us of this deed," unquote, is answered by her own, quote, "All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand," unquote. Macbeth provides some variations on the same theme in Act 4, Scene 1, quote, "The very firstling of my heart shall be the firstling of my hand," unquote. And in the banquet scene, quote, "Strange things I have in head that will to hand, which must be acted ere they may be scanned," unquote. The opposition between hand and the other organs recur again and again. Macbeth observes the functioning of his own organs with a strange objectivity. He speaks of his hands as though they have gained an independent life of their own. He exhorts his eyes to look at his hands and believes that his eyes have been made the fools of other senses. In the same scene, his footsteps seem, as it were, to be divorced from himself. There is division within Macbeth's self. As the play proceeds, he gradually falls apart. This theme of disunification of the organs, mind, soul and body, guilt and atonement, conscience and oblivion, concord and discord, is powerfully crystallized in the oxymorons of the porter. The gap between thought and action, wish and consequence, recurrently heightens the irony. The style of the porter's speech, however, is not alien to that of the remainder of the play. The antithetical quality of the verse is intended for comic purposes. The impact of the porter's phrases on the audience, having come freshly from the intense poetry of Macbeth's speeches, is calculated. Any analysis of a scene is incomplete without an interpretation of the function of the scene in the action of the play, how it helps to develop the action. It is a common tendency to identify the whole scene with the porter solely and with what he says and does, but it is often forgotten that Act 2, Scene 3 is an important marker of the action. It is in this scene that Duncan's murder is discovered and Macbeth must immediately put on the mask of innocence. He has to grasp the art of looking like the innocent flower but being the serpent under it. The murder of Duncan is to be discovered by rest of the world, and the tension and delay of its knowledge breaking on everyone is heightened so far by the porter's speech. The perfect setting for such a horrific discovery is created by Lennox's speech. Quote, "The night has been unruly where we lay, the earth was feverous and did shake," unquote. After the murder is discovered, Macbeth puts on a false face and kills the sleeping guards who were guarding Duncan, as if in a frenzied outburst of rage. Lady Macbeth fakes a faint, although according to some critics she really faints, and Malcolm and Donalbain, fearing that their father's murder is committed by a near one, decides to fly from the complex situation. Their decision proves decisive in the end, for had Malcolm not fled, Macbeth would probably have him murdered too. In the end, Malcolm comes back to be the king, supported by the English king and his army. Thus, important things take place in the porter scene. It begins with a drunken porter lousily talking to himself and ends with Malcolm taking a decision which will prove fatal to Macbeth in the end. The whole scene is linked so closely with the rest of the play, in content as well as in style, that it is clearly impossible to regard it as a barbarous interpolation by the actors. The antithetical style is a powerful means of suggesting the paradox and enigma of the nature of a man, the conflict within him between sin and grace, between reason and emotion, between discord and concord. Some critics have romanticized their interpretations of the scene to the extent where they deviate from the main text. Thomas De Quincey's On the Knocking at the Gate in Macbeth, for example, focuses on an emotionally charged understanding of the situation and its effect on the audience. However, De Quincey is sensitive in stating that the knocking at the gate makes the reaction of the world audible, and how, quote, "the human has made its reflux upon the fiendish, the pulses of life are beginning to beat again, and the re-establishment of the goings-on of the world in which we live first makes us profoundly sensible of the awful parenthesis that had suspended them." Unquote. To sum it up, the scene is one of the major creations of Shakespeare in the sense that it conveys so much and crystallizes such great amount of messages in such short space. It is therefore important to study it not independently, but in the context of the whole play, with its intricate patterns of various interconnected themes and issues.